Well, again, welcome, friends. As I mentioned when I first started, Vonita, who is really the one who is responsible for this particular process, although she will say Shoghi Effendi is the author, and all she did was to put it in a different format for us. Unfortunately, Vonita is not going to be able to be with us because she's not well. She returned to the hospital this morning, and she will be with us, of course, in spirit. And I ask that as we go through this, as always, that we keep her in mind and that we keep her in our prayers. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about how we came to have this particular process and why it's important. Vonita, in her search to understand the most vital and challenging issue, she felt that the Baha'is had the answer on how to resolve that. And as she searched out the Baha'i faith, she read a lot of materials, and in particular came to the advent of divine justice. And she saw in the advent of divine justice the answer for how to eradicate racial prejudice. And indeed, that's what the divine justice is all about. What she has been able to do with it is to put it in a form that we can use as a problem-solving tool, as a self-improvement tool, but also recognizing that its primary purpose is to help us transform into the spiritual beings that we were meant to be. Now, a little background for those who may not be familiar with the advent of divine justice. This was written around 1937, 1938. And it is a document to be used for teaching. And it is also a response that Shoghi Effendi had to Sadie's Oglesby, who was an African-American Baha'i who went on pilgrimage to Haifa. And at that time, he was asking her about the conditions in the United States, because the advent of divine justice is written to those of us in North America, Canada, and the US. And he was asking about African Americans and whether or not they were embracing the faith. And throughout her whole time on pilgrimage, he kept coming back to asking her. And one of the things she shared with him was that it's very difficult for African Americans. Many of them felt that when they did approach the faith, they were looking for a sanctuary, a home, a place where they were welcome. And as a number of you may know, during that time, the early 1930s, there was a great deal of overt racial prejudice in the US. And one of the things that Sadie shared with him was that when she and her husband learned of the Baha'i faith, the people that taught them, she said they were always on. They were always welcoming. They seemed to have no prejudice. Their hearts seemed to be pure. And one of the things that she said was that if they had ever caught them sleeping or not attentive, they would have left. So they were always looking for that wrong move. And so Shoghi Effendi said, well, what is it that is needed? Because what this faith is about is the oneness of all mankind, and that whatever was needed to make sure that everyone was included That's what they needed to do. And so in that regard, he told her that she needed to go back to the US and she needed to continue to be outspoken, just as her husband had been. She tended to feel that she was not the one to really carry this message. And she asked him to write something to the American people so that it would not just be her. And many years later, this was his response, because the ultimate of what the advent of divine justice is the eradication of all forms of prejudice, but especially racial prejudice. So when we're talking about how to even approach the writings, what the advent of divine justice is asking us to do, we have to approach it with a certain attitude, a certain posture. And that posture is the virtue of humility. And one might say, well, why do we have to be humble? One of the things that happens with the Baha'i faith, and Vonita loves to go into this, is in the writings from our figures, whether it's Baha'u'llah, Abdul Baha, Shoghi Effendi, or the Universal House of Justice, they always start out with the positive, building us up. And then they tend to let us know those areas that are not so good, that still needs to be worked on. And so you might say it tears us down and makes us think that, oh, yeah, we can aspire to this, but we're not yet there. And that makes us more humble, more open and ready to receive. And there's a supporting virtue, and that is of honesty. To do the work, we have to be both have humility. That means being vulnerable, being open. And we have to be brutally honest with ourselves in terms of where we are and what we need to do. So that is the approach that we have to have when we're doing this work. You know, the advent of divine justice adheres to the tablets of the divine plan, which Abdul Baha gave us. And what Shoghi Effendi does is tells us how to implement the plan, the instructions. And if we're going to follow those instructions, then we have to approach it with great humility and honesty. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the overall ADJ process. I'm going to give an overview of what that process looks like. And this is a diagram to show you. So this is the overview of the ADJ process. It consists of, we might say, 4 quadrants. And this may be too small for you to see on the screen to be able to read it, but I'm going to go into detail with each process, each quadrant rather. And so I'm going to take it one by one. And so the first is a reflection process. And this is an internal, it's the work that we have to do inside. And it's a reflection on, you might say, your personal assessment. I mentioned in the beginning that in order to do this, you had to approach it with a great deal of humility and honesty. Well, you start doing this first by assessing where you are. And it's an ongoing thing that you do. You're going to be doing this using the 3 spiritual prerequisites as the standards so that we can see the areas that we need to improve in. So we see where we are and where we need to improve. And then the next quadrant, it's bringing ourselves to account. And this too is an internal process. And in this, use the results of that first reflection process. We use the results of the reflection process to identify Baha'i sacred writings, prayers, and any other method that we might want to use. Could be meditation, to access a channel to God. And we're going to talk about the 5 steps of prayer, which you can see as an action plan for how to resolve a problem or an issue, and to reinforce and strengthen our resolve to the action using Baha'i prayers and other methods. So we have the reflection process, which is internal, and we have the bringing ourselves to account, which is also internal. And the next quadrant is what Vonita likes to call the scroll process, but it's really about outward communication. And it's how we communicate with others. And we execute whatever the plan is that we come up with, the plan of action. And it could be how we interact with another person based on what it is that we've said in terms of word or deed. And we use the directions and responsibilities within the communication process that Shoghi Effendi tells us about. And the 4th quadrant is the Double Crusade. And this is the inward communication. It's how we hear things, how we receive things. And the interaction, it may sometimes result in fallout, as listed in the Double Crusade as fallout and caveats. And we'll talk about that more. But the fallouts is an opportunity to use the issue to initiate that reflection process. It is also, it assures us to have faith in the Double Crusade process for spiritual growth, and expands the communication that we may have with groups and others. So now I'm going to go through in detail each of those quadrants. So the first one, the reflection process. As I mentioned, this is internal, and when we use the 3 spiritual prerequisites, which we're going to get to in more detail, when we use those, we're looking at that to create what you might refer to as a baseline. So you reflect on your initial self-assessment and whatever ongoing problems or issues that arise. And you're using the 3 spiritual prerequisites as the standard so that we may identify what the areas of improvement is. So that first part, when I mentioned that what you have to do is really to take a good look at where you are as it relates to your spiritual development. You're using the self-assessment as the way to get there. So the first part, the reflection process. And as I said, that's internal. The next, bringing ourselves to account. Again, it's an internal process. And we use the results of the reflection process to identify Baha'i sacred writings or personal prayers, or any other method that will open a channel to God. So we've been given in this faith so many types of prayers. And these prayers are to help us heal and to bring us closer to God. And so this is what we use as part of bringing ourselves to account. and then the reflection process. We use the 5 steps of prayer to develop an action plan for resolution of the problem or whatever the issue might be. And then we also reinforce and strengthen our resolve to action by, again, using the Baha'i prayers or writings. The third is the scroll process. That's the outward communication, it's action. And it's how we execute whatever the plan is with another person. And this could be, if there was an issue, I said something to someone and they became offended, and I've gone into my process to try to identify exactly what happened and what I need to do. Then it's how I go to that person and I try to resolve it. And as I mentioned, that is outward. That's where we're working with another person, or we're doing a particular action to rectify something. The Double Crusade process is the inward communication. And in a way, it's an action also because it's listening. And the interaction may result in a fallout as listed in the Double Crusade, fallout and caveats. And a fallout is an opportunity to use an issue to initiate the reflection process. And it assures us to have faith in the Double Crusade process for spiritual growth and expands communication with groups and institutions. We're going to mostly be focused only on the individual. You know, this process, we are the first student, we're the first teacher, and we're using this process first on ourselves and to really hone in the skills of using it. And now this is the 3 spiritual prerequisites that I was referring to. This is the climax of the book when we get to the very third one, the zenith. But before we can get to the zenith, we have to deal with 1 and 2. The first one is moral rectitude. It's our outward expression, how we carry ourselves. We're putting our best foot forward, or we're attempting to put our best foot forward. The second, absolute chastity. This is our inner thoughts and desires. And the zenith, really the combination of using and growing in the first 2, which is freedom, complete freedom from prejudice. And this is where we are reaching toward that spiritual transformation. Because if we're really making progress on moral rectitude and absolute chastity, we are transforming ourselves to the spiritual beings that Baha'u'llah, Abdu'l-Baha, Shoghi Effendi, and what our faith is all about. It is only by transforming ourselves that we're going to actually be able to make a difference. Shoghi Effendi recognized that racism is a spiritual disease, and the only way to really get rid of it is that we have to become spiritual beings, which is truly our real selves. We are truly spiritual beings on a material plane in our bodies, right? So as I said, let me go into more about the spiritual prerequisites. So the first one I mentioned was rectitude of conduct. And I said, this is external, it's our actions and words and how we react to things. So with that prerequisite, these are the spiritual standards, or some of them. But what I understand is that there's probably a lot more, but this is what Shoghi Effendi felt that we were ready to deal with and what was necessary to help us get to the elimination of all forms of prejudice. So with rectitude of conduct, the spiritual standards are justice, equity, truthfulness, honesty, fair-mindedness, reliability, and trustworthiness. This is rectitude of conduct. The second spiritual prerequisite was chaste and holy life. And that's it's our inner thoughts and desires. And some of the standards that go along with that is modesty, purity, temperance, decency, clean-mindedness, moderation, and all that pertains to the language we use, the amusements we partake in, the literary and artistic items that we get involved with, the type of artistic vocations that we allow. And then we come to the third, the zenith. And that's the elimination of racial prejudice. And that is both external, the actions, and it is also internal, because it's the work that we do on ourselves. And the standards, the spiritual standards that come with it is sacrifice, care and vigilance, moral courage, fortitude, tact and sympathy, fearlessness, determination, courage, and genuine love for all mankind. We often hear people say, be like Abdu'l-Baha. Abdu'l-Baha, for those who are not Baha'is, is considered the perfect exemplar. And we look to him to understand how to carry ourselves, what to do. And I want to share a story of how Abdu'l-Baha, in so many ways, demonstrated to us, provided examples to us of freedom from prejudice. He had been invited by Louis Gregory and others and Louis Gregory is an African-American Baha'i who back in the 1900s, around the 30s, he had set up a luncheon, and this was in Washington, D.C. at Howard University. And Jim Crow was very much enforced, and people kind of knew where they could go, where they shouldn't go, and what the social norms were for that time. However, Abdu'l-Baha, also knowing this, was going to demonstrate in his way how people should be dealt with, of all types. And the luncheon is about to happen, places are set, and Abdu'l-Baha looks around and he does not see Louis Gregory, who was one of the main people to help organize this luncheon. And he says, "Where is Louis?" And Louis Gregory was somewhere out in the hall. He was not going to go in because it was an all-white gathering. And Abdu'l-Baha would not let the luncheon proceed. He says, "Bring me Gregory, bring me Louis." And they went and they found Louis Gregory and they brought him in. And Abdu'l-Baha rearranged the place cards and sat Louis Gregory at the right-hand side, the side of honor, right next to him. And in just doing that, He was sending a clear message. He was showing that this African American man should be at the table with everyone else, and not just at the table, but he could be in a place of honor. So here, he was demonstrating courage, fearlessness, tact and sympathy, genuine love for all humankind. And, sometimes people say, well, why do we just focus on the Black and the white? One of the things Shoghi Effendi said when he was doing this is that these are the extremes. And if we can resolve the issue of racial prejudice between the Black and the white, all in between will be worked out. Because the Black and the white was the most difficult to try to do. So here we have the reflection process. Now remember, I was saying to you that in the very beginning, you establish your baseline, you do your personal assessment, you take stock of where you are in relations to those three spiritual prerequisites: moral rectitude, absolute chastity, complete freedom from prejudice. And we use those standards, those spiritual standards that I mentioned, to assess yourself. And I will ask myself, okay, I'm approaching this with absolute humility. I'm really opening myself up. I'm looking at, where am I now? Where am I now as it relates to moral rectitude? Do I approach things in a very truthful manner? Am I honest? Or am I only honest when it's convenient? Am I fair-minded? Or do I take advantage of people sometimes? Where am I now? And what do I need to work on? As I go through this, let's say I have a spreadsheet for myself on each one of these. As I look at rectitude of conduct, I say, well, I tend to be a pretty honest person. I'm truthful. So I might say, okay, I'm doing okay on that. Doesn't mean I'm perfect, but for now, I'm doing okay. And I go, well, reliability and trustworthiness, yeah, I still need to work on that. Then I look at, well, how can I do better? How can I do better in these areas? What are the actions I can do? How do I get myself to a better place with it? So this is that self-reflection that's happening. So the first level is the three spiritual prerequisites, which are the foundation. And the other is that self-reflection. And so here, Baha'i prayers and corresponding standards. Remember, I mentioned that the things that we have to do is to use the prayers and the writings. What does that do for us? Well, we're using the prayers and the writings. It's helping to heal us, but it's also opening us. It's opening our hearts, softening our hearts, making it possible to form a better connection with God. So the standards to each spiritual prerequisite has corresponding Baha'i prayers that can be used to help us. And the thing is that we have so many prayers, even for, on the same topic. We have, I don't know how many healing prayers, how many prayers for aid and assistance, how many prayers for our spiritual development and growth. We have prayers to help us whenever we fall short. So we can look at the problems and the issues that we have. This is how we use that. We use this as our way to, like I said, heal ourselves and bring us closer to God. And always, again, being really open with humility and vulnerability, being honest. Let's see what the next step is. This is the bringing ourselves to account. Some of you may be familiar with the hidden word, which says, I think it's hidden word number 31. O son of being, bring thyself to account each day, ere thou art summoned to a reckoning. For death unheralded shall come upon thee, and thou shalt be called to give account for thy deeds. This is how we learn to take responsibility for our actions, beg for forgiveness, and make amends, and develop our spiritual souls. So in this graphic, it's really talking about, it's showing what that process is. The absolute foundation of the spiritual prerequisites, using corresponding Baha'i prayers based on where we fall short, the problems or issues that we're trying to resolve, and praying with humility and honesty, helping us to open ourselves up to God and to healing. Communicating with God using the 5 steps to prayer to develop an action plan. Let's look at the next thing. So I've been mentioning the 5 steps to prayer. And this is it. Now, believe it or not, this was something that is not in the Advent of Divine Justice, but it was something that was part of Pilgrim Notes, but it went before Shoghi Effendi, and he said, yes, this is good to use. And so it works beautifully with the Advent of Divine Justice in terms of us really bringing ourselves to account and taking the steps to improve ourselves. So the first step is we pray and we meditate. We pray and meditate about whatever the issue is. We use the prayers of the manifestations as they have the greatest power. Let me say something about that. We think of the prayers that we have gotten from the manifestations as what helps to not only heal us and open us up, but it energizes us. It gives us that spiritual energy that we need. They have the greatest power. We remain in the silence of contemplation for a few minutes. In other words, we pray And we don't just go, okay, done, I'm good. But rather we pray and we sit in the silence, because this is our time to communicate. So we have to be around to listen. We have to be around to receive. The second step is decide. We arrive at a decision and we hold on to this. The decision is usually born during the contemplation. It may seem almost impossible of something to accomplish, but if it seems to be an answer to a prayer or a way of solving the problem, then immediately take the next step. And the next step is to persevere in carrying the decision through. And here we're told to have determination to carry the decision through. Many fail here. The decision budding into determination is blighted and instead becomes a wish or vague longing. When determination is born, immediately take the next step. And what is the next step? It's to have faith and confidence. Have faith and confidence that the power will flow through you. The right way will appear. The door will open. The right thought, the right message, the right principle, or maybe the right book will be given to you. And to have confidence that the right thing will come to your need. Then, as you rise from prayer, take at once the fifth step. And that fifth step is to act. Act as though it had all been answered. Then act with tireless, ceaseless energy. And as you act, you yourself will become a magnet, which will attract more power to your being until you become an unobstructed channel for the divine power to flow through you. So what does all of this mean? You know, when we say that we do this, it seems like it's a linear process that you just go boom, 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 from one thing to the other. Well, I wish it was like that, but no, it's not. You know, sometimes what happens is that you start at the first level where you're praying and you're meditating, and maybe nothing comes to you right then, you know, and you're picking your prayers or writings, but you don't really get anything. That's okay, because you need to keep working at it. This is a process. But sometimes when you are in that state and something comes to you, and as I said, it feels as if it is an answer, you take that, you make a decision to act on it. And you have to then believe it and carry it forward with confidence and faith. It says to believe as if it has already been done. You can see the outcome. You have faith. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't mean that it's not okay, or it was the wrong thing. Maybe it moved you a little bit closer to where you need it to be. And so let's look at what happens next. And this is what we call the transition to the scroll process. Okay. And what this has to do with is you are looking at the interaction between the word or deed and what needs to happen. So remember, we said act until you become an unobstructed channel for the divine power to flow through you. And as you act, you will attract to your being more power. act as if everything that you needed is done. And that's the action, because everything we do, we have to always try it out. And we get more information. We learn more. So there is a contract for that interaction. And so I'm going to talk now about the third and fourth quadrant we talked about in terms of communication. And I want to read this to you because this is what we call the binding contract for interaction. And I want to talk about what that contract looks like. So the binding contract contains all the characteristics of a real contract. And it is. There's a contract date. There's two or more parties. There's acceptance and value for the duration of the contract, and a penalty for non-compliance. So just, to think about this for a minute. This contract is between the black and the white, and all in between. So it's all of us. And what we're talking about here, you think about this, is that when we became Baha'is, and I'm assuming many in the audience are Baha'is, but this isn't something that's just for Baha'is. It's really for all of us. But we follow from the covenant, which is from Baha'u'llah. And when we accepted the authority of that covenant, it's a path that takes us to Abdul Baha and Shoghi Effendi and to the current day of the Universal House of Justice. It is a clear path to what God wants us to do through his manifestations and the sacred scriptures. This is our contract. So the binding contract binds the ADJ cycles, internal processes of reflection and bringing ourselves to account, to the external process of communication and the crusade. And the binding contract also binds us through our commitment to focus on the three spiritual prerequisites as our standards and our commitment to God through Baha'u'llah's message. So what does it say about that contract? A tremendous effort is required by both races if their outlook, their manners, and conduct are to reflect in this darkened age the spirit and teachings of the faith of Baha'u'llah. Casting away once and for all the fallacious doctrine of racial superiority with all its attendant evils, confusion, and miseries, and welcoming and encouraging the intermixture of races and tearing down the barriers that now divide them. They should each and day and night to fulfill their particular responsibilities in the common task that so urgently faces them. Let them, while each is attempting to contribute its share to the solution of this perplexing problem, call to mind the warnings of Abdul Baha and visualize, while there is yet time, the dire consequences that must follow if this challenging and unhappy situation that faces the entire American nation is not remedied. Now, friends, we are seeing in this day and age exactly what some of that is. We are seeing that darkened age is now. The penalty, the penalty is this: Let them, while each is attempting to contribute its share to the solution of this perplexing problem, call to mind the warnings of Abdu'l-Baha and visualize, while there is yet time, the dire consequences that must follow. And as I said, we are seeing those consequences now. So let's look at the next. So when we look at the third spiritual prerequisite, which is the freedom, the zenith, the freedom from prejudice. This is the standard, how it's to be applied. Whether colored or non-colored, and this is the language of the early 1900s, neither race has the right or can consciously claim to be regarded as absolved from such an obligation as having realized such hopes or having faithfully followed such an example. Let them call to mind fearlessly and determinedly the example and conduct of Abdu'l-Baha while in their midst. We talked about, we used the example of him at the luncheon. His genuine love, his courage, his informal and indiscriminating fellowship, his contempt for impatience of criticism tempered by his tact and wisdom. Let them revive and perpetuate the memory of those unforgettable and historic episodes and occasions on which he so strikingly demonstrated his keen sense of justice, his spontaneous sympathy for the downtrodden, his ever-abiding sense of the oneness of the human race, and his overflowing love for its members, and his displeasure with those who dared to flout his wishes or deride his methods or challenge his principles or nullify his acts. To discriminate against any race on the ground of its being socially backwards, politically immature, or numerically in a minority is a flagrant violation of the spirit that emanates the faith of Baha'u'llah. This is so important. And so we look at the responsibilities that each has. And it says the responsibilities of the wife is to abandon once and for all their usually inherent and at times subconscious sense of superiority, to correct the tendency towards revealing a patronizing attitude towards members of another race, to persuade them through their intimate, spontaneous, and informal association with them of the genuineness of their friendship and the sincerity of their intentions. Remember, I mentioned the story of Sadie Oglesby, how she said that the folks that taught her and her husband, they were genuine and they persisted until they had won them over because they were showing them genuineness of their friendship and sincerity of their intentions. And the final thing it says is to master, whites need to master their impatience of any lack of responsiveness on the part of a people who have received for so long a period such grievous and slow healing wounds. And what are the responsibilities of the Blacks? Black responsibilities to the process is the warmth of their response, their readiness to forget the past, and their ability to wipe out every trace of suspicion that may still linger in their hearts and minds. And then there are mutual responsibilities. And the mutual responsibilities are as follows. And this is all from the Advent of Divine Justice. Let neither think that the solution of so vast a problem is a matter that exclusively concerns the other. Let neither think that such a problem can either easily or immediately be resolved. Let neither think that they can wait confidently for the solution of this problem until the initiative has been taken and favorable circumstances created by agencies that stand outside the orbit of their faith. In other words, no one else can just do this. We must do our part. Let neither think that anything short of genuine love, extreme patience, true humility, consummate tact, sound initiative, mature wisdom, and deliberate, persistent, and prayerful effort can succeed in blotting out the stain which this patent evil has left on their fair name of their common country. Let them rather believe and be firmly convinced that on their mutual understanding, their amity and sustained cooperation must depend more than on any other force or organization operating outside the circle of their faith. The deflection of that dangerous course so greatly feared by Abdu'l-Baha and the materialization of the hopes that he cherished for their joint contribution to the fulfillment of that country's glorious destiny. Now, in the Advent of Divine Justice, it talks about America's glorious destiny. But we can't get there unless we're doing our part. Or how long it takes us to get there is really determined by how hard we work. And it's telling us that we are the ones that have to be majorly involved in the work. Now, this graphic that I have up, which is called the Double Crusade, how we listen. Remember, I was showing in the quadrant that there's a part of how we take in information. And in the second part of the Double Crusade process, Shoghi Effendi describes the reaction of all listeners, whether individuals or groups, to how we receive and process information from an initiator, a speaker, whoever's speaking. The information received may be positive, it could be neutral, it could be negative. The reaction to the information received may be positive, neutral, or negative as well. But additionally, in the Double Crusade process, Shoghi Effendi provides to the listener a method for identifying fallout, acknowledging caveats, and using God's assurance to build the spiritual confidence and fortitude to move the issue to the reflection process. We're always trying to move things to make it so that we're dealing on a spiritual plane. So Shoghi Effendi is telling us how to do that. Let's take a look. So in the Double Crusade, there's such things what we call fallout. And fallout refers to any misunderstanding or miscommunications, misperceptions that generate dissension, either directly or indirectly. Okay? The negative interaction that causes dissension, it can be verbal or physical. If fallout is not identified, a range of denial and avoidance behaviors will close the path to spiritual progress. So let's take a closer look at that. So interaction between individuals, like I said, that's what we're really focused on here, may result in fallout. Fallout creates suffering, which can be mental and or physical stress. And Shoghi Effendi has what we call caveats. And he has identified and listed all possible outcomes of fallouts. And we call them caveats or warnings. So when there's a problem that happens, we can look to see, did he tell us what this was? So we can identify. This is a blessing because it allows us to be able to identify the nature of the fallout and to confirm that the fallout is a necessary part of the process in the total cycle. We can link the specific fallout to a caveat, and the result is the acknowledgement and understanding of the issue. Well, let me see if I can tell you what some of those caveats are. So, a list of caveats. This is what it says in the Divine Justice. In the conduct of this twofold crusade, the valiant warriors struggling in the name of the cause of Baha'u'llah must of necessity encounter stiff resistance and suffer many a setback. Their own instincts, no less than the fury of conservative forces, the opposition of vested interests, and the objections of a corrupt and pleasure-seeking generation must be reckoned with, resolutely resisted, and completely overcome. As their defensive measures for the impending struggle are organized and extended, the storms of abuse and ridicule, campaigns of condemnation and misrepresentation may be unloosed against them. Their faith, they may soon find, has been assaulted, their motives misconstrued, their aims defamed, their aspirations derided, their institutions scorned, their influence belittled, their authority undermined, and their cause at times deserted by a few who will either be incapable of appreciating the nature of their ideals or unwilling to bear the brunt of the mounting criticisms which such a contest is sure to involve. Because of Abdu'l-Baha, the beloved master has prophesied, many a test will be visited upon you, troubles will befall you, and suffering afflict you. So this is a list of caveats. And we're told that suffering takes two forms: physical, mental, or emotional pain. And this is when we're stuck in this suffering state after the initial fallout. So something happens, and when I get stuck, it means I'm just ruminating. I can't get beyond just what happened. And I'm dealing with the scorn and the ridicule, and I'm not seeing exactly what else is going on. But we're told that this is when we're stuck. It's the result of a human interaction. The next level of suffering is spiritual suffering, which is to bear, suffer, endure, abide, tolerate, occurs after we acknowledge the caveats. So I just went through the list of caveats. So when we acknowledge that this is what's going on, the caveats refer to the spiritual process of the acknowledgement and acceptance of the issue that we must face. And then, of course, we have God's assurances, okay? So God's assurances, Shoghi Effendi lists God's assurances, and he tells us that these help us to accept the struggle that we must go through to develop our spiritual qualities, to transform our perceptions of the struggle from a problem to a spiritual opportunity. When we see it as a spiritual opportunity, this is when we really are able to grow. This is when we can see where the situation is coming from. Let me see if I have the list of God's assurances. So God's assurances, here's some examples. And this again is from the advent of divine justice. Already in the land where the greatest battles of the faith have been fought and its most rapacious enemies have lived, the march of events, the slow yet steady infiltration of its ideals, and the fulfillment of its prophecies have resulted not only in disarming and in transforming the character of some of its most redoubtable enemies, but also in securing their firm and unreserved allegiance for its founders. So complete a transformation, so startling a reversal of attitude can only be effected if that chosen vehicle, which is designed to carry the message of Baha'u'llah to the hungry, the restless, and unshepherded multitudes, is itself thoroughly cleansed from the defilement which it seeks to remove. So think about that. You know, it's telling us, it is upon you, therefore, my best beloved friends, that I wish to impress not only the urgency and imperative necessity of your holy task, but also the limitless possibilities which it possesses of rising to such an exalted level, not only the life and activities of your own community, but the motives and standards that govern the relationships existing among the people to which you belong. Undismayed by the formidable nature of this task, you will, I am confident, meet as befits you the challenge of these times, so fraught with peril, so full of corruption, and yet so pregnant with the promise of a future so bright that no previous age in the annals of mankind can rival its glory. So these are God's assurances. And, you know, when he talks about, a time when, because of how they carried themselves, think about the time of Baha'u'llah, when he was a prisoner, how the way he carried himself and the followers at that time, the enemies, some of them changed the way in which they dealt with them. They had a reversal of attitude. That came because of who Baha'u'llah was and what his message is all about. So these are God's assurances that we're told. Okay? So the next. We move to looking at the overall process. And like I said earlier, it is a circle, you know. Shoghi Effendi directed us to continuously practice this cycle. The cycle adheres to the tablets of the divine plan. Each time that you complete all of these processes, you have completed an entire cycle. The entire ADJ cycle may take veritable amounts of time to complete. Remember, as I said, sometimes you have to stop and go back, or you need to do more work in a particular area. But you're going through a cycle. The zenith point that we're always aiming for is to bring ourselves to account. The ADJ cycle also builds intimacy with God through prayer. So when we each day, at the end of our day, call ourselves to account and we reflect on where we are, what we have done well that day, and what are the challenges that still remain before us. This is us with humility and honesty, taking stock of where we are. And although you may get stuck at a point, the most challenging thing is to be at the point of fallout so that you can work this out. Each completed cycle helps you to move closer towards spiritual growth. The cycle is lifelong, as our life purpose is to reorient ourselves to the Baha'i standards. So here is sort of what it looks like when we do the whole thing. Through humility and honesty, whites allow themselves to be vulnerable, to initiate the supreme effort that is required of them. Whites demonstrate their vulnerability in abandoning their air of superiority through a continuous supreme effort until it touches the hearts of the Blacks. In turn, once touched, and through humility and honesty, the Blacks allow themselves to be vulnerable, to initiate the required corresponding effort to abandon their suspicions and begin to trust. At the level of interactions, both whites and Blacks make progress through the iterations of this cycle over time. As a result, they build trust and confidence that forms the basis of relationships, true, intimate relationships. On the spiritual level, the cycle tears down the sense of superiority for the whites and suspicions for the Blacks, and replace these with the ability to see each other as spiritual human beings. Once they perceive each other and themselves as spiritual human beings, oneness can occur and spiritual equity can be achieved. Friends, this is where we're trying to get to. This is what it's all about. So what I've provided today is an overview of the ADJ process and how to use it every day to help transform yourself to that spiritual being that our faith tells us we are. And if you're ready to really do that work, we invite you to join us on Saturday afternoons for what we call deep dives, or the practice, to really teach you how to use this method. And I want to end with this prayer. It's Abdul Baha's vision. Look ye not upon the present. Fix your gaze upon the times to come. In the beginning, how small is the seed, yet in the end, it is a mighty tree. Look not upon the seed, look ye upon the tree and its blossoms, and its leaves and its fruits. Consider the days of Christ, when none but a small band followed him. Then observe what a mighty tree that seed became. Behold ye its fruit. And now shall come to pass even greater things than these. For this is the summons of the Lord of hosts. This is the trumpet call of the living Lord. This is the anthem of world peace. This is the standard of righteousness and trust and understanding raised among all the variegated peoples of the globe. This is the splendor of the Son of Truth. This is the holiness of the Spirit of God himself. This most powerful of dispensations will encompass all the earth, and beneath its banner, with all peoples gathered and be sheltered together. Know then the vital import of this tiny seed, that the true husband hath with the hands of his mercy sown in the plowed fields of the Lord, and watered with the rain of bestowals and the bounties, and is now nurturing in the heat and light of the day star of truth. Wherefore, O ye loved ones of God, offer up thanks unto him, since he hath made you the object of such bounties and the recipients of such gifts. Blessed are ye, glad tidings to you, for this is abounding grace. I thank you all for being with us today. And I want to open it up for questions. Well, I see that Deborah has a question, and she says, thanks for sharing this framework. Please share next steps for those interested in applying. So as I mentioned at that last slide, you can go to our website, www.adj-wtru.org, and there you can register. There are some things that you need to do to prepare yourself to participate in the weekly practice. So I think there's a 3 or 4 things you have to do before you can just jump in. But I'm wondering if Mary Rose is here. And if Mary Rose is here, if she would put in the chat exactly what the particular steps are people need to do now. Mary Rose has been working very, very diligently with this whole process with Vonita for several years now, as have Milagros Red Feather is also involved. And so, Mary Rose, I see that you are here. Would you put in the chat? I've given them the website, but I believe there's a couple of things that they need to do, observe before they actually enter into your weekly practice. So if you put that in, we can make sure that everybody sees that. Are there any other questions in terms of what I was sharing with you today? You can find, so one of the questions is, will we share the slides? If you go to the website, there is so many resources there. Let me tell you about what's on that website. On the website, you will actually see recorded presentations that Vonita has done, explaining all of this, in some cases in even more detail. You'll also find readings that will be very helpful. So on the website, you will see pretty much the slides. So there's even more of the slides than what I shared with you today. And so you will find that there, yes. This is the website that everybody can see here. And someone asks, is the weekly practice ongoing? Yes, it is ongoing, but as I mentioned, there are some things that you need to do before you can just jump right into the weekly practice. And that information is on the website as well. So the first step is to sign up for what Mary Rose calls the toolbox sessions. And you just go to the website, complete the form, and they will schedule these sessions. Once you have completed the toolbox sessions, then you'll be able to join into the weekly, what they call deep dives, okay? And that's really great because people come and they share where they are in their process, as well as get more information and get deeper into the process. And I've found for myself doing this, it's amazing how you grow over time with it. You know, some of these things are things that we have been using, but not in a systematic way. And what this process has done is it really gives you a systematic way to approach this. And you can see how you grow and change in doing it. Mary Rose, thanks for putting that information in the chat for us. Well, friends, if there are no other questions, then we will end for the day. And I thank you all for coming. Please, as I mentioned in the beginning, please keep Vonita in your prayers. Thank you and have a wonderful afternoon.